Welcome back. In the previous lesson, we reviewed our big scorecard of theories about the nature of minds. We reminded ourselves why functionalism seems to be the theory to beat, but we also reminded ourselves about some of the controversies around the desiderata that we used to organize our inquiry and about how well each theory satisfies each of those desiderata. We were left with a good sense of why functionalism is such a strong contender, but we also identified some open questions and continuing disputes. In the end, I suggested that resolving those disputes is likely going to be a big and complicated interdisciplinary project, and that seems pretty reasonable to me. If that's right, then philosophical inquiry is not entirely distinct from or insulated from other forms of inquiry, especially scientific inquiry about the nature of minds. To put this in perspective, consider an idea we've discussed several times in the class, the idea that we care about the nature of minds because theories about knowledge and theories about responsibility make assumptions about minds. The upshot is that if we care about things like knowledge or responsibility, then we ought to care about minds. And I, for one, care about both knowledge and responsibility. At this point, I want to add some complications to this way of thinking about philosophical inquiry. First, I use the examples of knowledge and responsibility because those are aspects of our lives that many of us already care about. You might not have taken college classes about epistemology and ethics before, but you surely thought about beliefs and knowledge, actions and responsibility. You've probably thought about those things with respect to characters in books and movies, with celebrities and politicians, and likely in your own life experiences. But I could just as well have made the point by saying that facts about minds are integral to our views about government, logic, religion, or art. Many philosophical views, maybe all philosophical views, make assumptions about minds or have implications for our theories about minds. So there are many reasons to care about minds. And this is the second wrinkle. For it's clear that many aspects of our lives outside of philosophy also have direct or indirect implications for our theories about minds. Although it's a relatively new point of view in the history of ideas, as we mentioned already, these days it seems pretty obvious that facts about neuroscience and psychology are relevant to theories about minds. But more than that, minds are implicated in the very idea of science. Science, I take it, is a form of inquiry. I would say that science is a method of acquiring knowledge, and I've already said that theories of knowledge make assumptions about minds. If so, we can't fully understand how science works unless we can understand how creatures like us can engage in science and acquire knowledge. And that's going to require saying something about the cognitive capacities that are needed to have knowledge or engage in inquiry generally and to conduct scientific inquiry in particular. How do we do it? That's a good question, and we can ask the same question about art and engineering and medicine and cuisine. These are activities that we human beings do. Doing them requires certain capacities, including certain cognitive and psychological capacities. Minds, as it turns out, are integral to many aspects of our lives. And this leads me to the third complication. I just said that minds are integral to many aspects of our lives, like knowledge, responsibility, science, arts, medicine, religion, and more. But I could just as well have said that knowledge, responsibility, science, arts, and medicine are integral to minds. I organized our discussion of theories about minds according to 4 desiderata for theories about the nature of minds. We organized our discussion in this way because this is a class in philosophy of mind, and that's the kind of inquiry that we're studying. But by the same token, it's only because we already have an idea about what minds can do that we're in a position to identify those desiderata. So we could have started out by asking, what does it take to engage in science, art, engineering, religion, medicine, and politics? From there, we could have come up with a list of capacities that seem to be necessary to do those things. And from there, we might arrive at the very same desiderata that I introduced when starting our inquiry in a different place. We can burn the candle from either end. The idea then is that minds as objects of inquiry and philosophy as a method of inquiry are deeply interconnected with other objects of inquiry and other methods of inquiry. In fact, Some people have thought that it's a distinctive feature of philosophy that its objects and methods are not easily isolated from other subjects and their methods. The final complication that I want to mention comes from the sections of Kwame Anthony Appiah's textbook that I asked you to read for this week. Appiah distinguishes the systematic form of inquiry that we've been examining and practicing, which he calls formal philosophy, from more traditional and less systematized forms of inquiry into the same topics that he calls folk philosophy. And he distinguishes these forms of philosophical inquiry from both religion and science. Appiah illustrates these distinctions through the examples of beliefs about witches and magic in the Asande culture of Central Africa. The Asande, he argues, do not attempt to systematize and interrogate their beliefs in the ways typical of so-called Western forms of inquiry, including the kind of philosophy that we've been studying. They don't think about beliefs and knowledge as Western-trained philosophers do. But Appiah also argues that his approach does not imply that we and the Asande could both be right, even when our beliefs are contradictory. That is, recognizing different forms of life and different forms of inquiry doesn't require us to adopt some kind of radical relativist view that gives up on the notions of truth or knowledge. On the contrary, Appiah recommends a pluralistic approach to inquiry in which different forms of inquiry contribute to the totality of human flourishing in different ways. This doesn't mean that we can never be wrong. Some attempts at inquiry will fail. For example, according to Appiah, science is typically more systematic in its collection of evidence than other forms of inquiry. Attempts at scientific inquiry that aren't systematic are likely to fail. At the same time, that doesn't mean that systematic science is the only way to learn about the world. I can learn about life in other parts of the world by visiting those places, or reading about them, or watching documentaries. Those are not forms of scientific inquiry, but they're still ways of increasing my understanding of the world. Pluralism is not anything goes. Rather, pluralism about inquiry instructs us to be open to having our lives and knowledge improved by new forms of inquiry, or by old ones that we didn't try before. That requires us to have a measure of intellectual humility, to be open to our views being wrong or our inquiries failing. And it also requires a measure of optimism and hope. On the one hand, we have to acknowledge that we don't already know all the answers. Like Descartes, we can recognize that some of the answers we thought we knew could turn out to be wrong. And we can learn that some forms of inquiry are not suited for some objects of inquiry. For example, Plato and Aristotle were wrong to think that the solar system has to be organized around perfect circles. Mythology and geometry are not the way to learn about planetary orbits. But we can be wrong, and that's okay. That's the intellectual humility part. On the other hand, we have hope. We're in a position to learn more, to improve our beliefs and enrich our lives. We're not trapped by Plato's cosmology or Aristotle's physics. Despite their genius, we just know more about the world than they did. We have a wider variety of ideas and experiences available to us. We have methods and tools of inquiry that they couldn't have imagined, and we still have philosophy as well. We can have intellectual hope as well as intellectual humility. My hope is that this class has expanded your knowledge and enriched your thinking about minds in particular and about philosophy in general. And I hope we'll see you in future philosophy classes here at UC. However that may be, I hope you'll put to use the skills we've practiced here, skills of careful analytic reading, thinking, and writing. Those will serve you well no matter which paths of inquiry you travel.